Welcome to Meet the Pilgrims. On the morning of September 6, 1620, a fine wind was blowing. 102 passengers were crowded onto the Mayflower. Captain Jones called to his sailors. Up went the ship's sails. The Mayflower started out to sea. Now, all the passengers had one thing in common. They were all leaving their homes in England to go across the ocean to a far off land. The Pilgrims stood together on the ship's deck. They watched the green hills of England slowly drop out of sight. The Mayflower was the only home these 102 pilgrims had. Soon, the Mayflower was far out to sea. The Pilgrims turned from their railings and began to set their home to rights. They looked for places for their families to sleep. The only covered deck was very small. There were not enough bunks for everyone, so they put up as many hammocks as they could and made beds on the floor for the rest of the people. The children explored the ship. They had been told to stay out of the sailors' way, and most of them did, but not the Billington boys. Little Francis and John Billington got into everyone's way. It was not easy to get away from the Billington boys. The Mayflower was so crowded that no one had a quiet place of his own. Many of the Pilgrims had never gone so far out to sea before. The rolling of the boat made many of them sick. So did some of the food. The women had to cook out on the open deck. They could not cook every day. Sometimes the wind blew too hard. Captain Jones was afraid the women's fires might spread and burn up his ship. So on windy days, the Pilgrims had nothing to eat but dry, cold food. For a month, the Mayflower had good weather. By early October, they were halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. Then the ship ran into a storm. Great waves began to crash over the deck. The captain ordered the sails taken down. He sent all the Pilgrims to the covered deck. The Mayflower was tossed this way and that. Water ran through the ship. It soaked the Pilgrims' beds. It soaked their food. It soaked their clothes. The Pilgrims were ice cold and wet to the skin. Many were sick. Many were afraid. The ship creaked and cracked. The Pilgrims were sure the Mayflower was going to break in two. The ship was in storms most of October. Then the sun came out. The sea grew quiet. The Pilgrims could come up on the open deck again. The cold, fresh November air smelled wonderful to them. But the Pilgrims were thin and weak. They had been at sea for more than 2 months. They longed for the sight of land. Just a few days later, one of the sailors cried out. He said that he saw Cape Cod ahead. The Pilgrims ran to the Mayflower's railings. In the early morning light, they saw a white sand beach. They saw woods and bushes. They saw America. Captain Jones said that Cape Cod was a long arm of land. It curved out into the sea from a part of America called New England. The captain said English fishermen and explorers had been to this part of America, but no English people had ever tried to live there. The Mayflower came to rest in a quiet bay now called Provincetown Harbor. The Pilgrims looked at the land where they would live. Far in the distance, they saw a wide river. On the nearby shore, the woods came right down to the sea. The skies were filled with birds, and the sea was alive with fish. Right there on the Mayflower, the Pilgrims wrote and signed an important document called the Mayflower Compact. After they had signed the agreement, they were ready to explore the land. Miles Standish picked out William Bradford and 13 other men to go ashore with him. Standish and the men lowered the Mayflower's rowboat into the water. The Pilgrims lost sight of the men. They watched and waited. They heard nothing but the wind and the wild crying of water birds. They saw nothing but gray skies and a cold and lonely land. The afternoon went by. Then, just as it grew dark, the men came out of the woods. They rode back to the Mayflower. The men had lots of good news. The land seemed good for farming. The trees were fine for building houses and barns, and they had seen no Indians. So it seemed safe for the Pilgrims to go ashore the next day. But there was bad news too. All of the water in the ponds was seawater. It was salty. Salt water was no good for drinking or cooking or farming. Unless a freshwater lake or river was found, the Pilgrims could never settle here. Standish said as soon as a fishing boat was put together, they would explore farther. The river they had seen in the distance might be a freshwater river. On Monday, the men brought the 4 pieces of the fishing boat up from the Mayflower's hold. Piece by piece, the sailors took it ashore. Then the sailors rowed Standish and some of the men to the beach. Standish told the sailors to bring the carpenters to shore next. He wanted them to get right to work nailing the fishing boat together again. After a while, all the Pilgrims went ashore. The women washed the family clothes. The children raced up and down the sand. Before long, the women and children were wet and cold, but it felt wonderful to be on land again. As soon as the sun was going down, Standish said everyone must get back to the Mayflower. He was also worried about something else. The carpenters had told him it would take days to fix the fishing boat. He could not wait days for the boat. Winter was coming. He must find a place for the Pilgrims to live. He decided to set out on foot as soon as they could. The men struggled along for 2 days. They had the feeling that Indians were hiding behind every tree, but they saw no one. The discouraged men went back to the Mayflower. There was a meeting to decide what to do. Their fishing boat was fixed now, and they could use it to go exploring. Captain Jones got out his maps. One of his officers, named Robert Coppin, pointed out a place about 45 miles across the bay. Coppin said that he had been there once. It had fresh water and a fine harbor. If the land was good for farming, it might be just the place for the Pilgrims. Mr. Standish said he and some of the men would go there at once in the fishing boat, and Coppin said he would go along to show them the way. The day was cold and windy when the men set out. It began to rain. Then it snowed. High waves rocked the little fishing boat. The men's clothes were soaked with ice cold water. Their wet clothes froze in the cold, cold air, but they sailed on all day. When it grew dark, they took their boat to shore, made a fire on the beach, cut down branches, and put them all around the fire. When morning came, the men saw they were on a small island about 3 miles from shore. After waiting 2 days, on a Monday, they could explore the land and look for their new home. Everything about the land made them happy. William Bradford said it was a most hopeful place. The land was good for planting. There were 2 fine rivers. The harbor was deep enough for a ship as big as the Mayflower. They sailed back to the Mayflower with their good news. At last, they had found a place in America for the Pilgrims to live. By December 16, 1620, the Mayflower docked in the harbor. After the long voyage, many were sick. Those who were well took care of the sick ones, and they set to work building their new town. The name of the town is Plymouth in the state of Massachusetts. It is still there today. You can visit the harbor and see the place where they began their town about 400 years ago. They built a meeting house and family homes. That first winter was very difficult. Many pilgrims were sick, and some even died. When spring came, they could spend more time working outside, preparing fields to grow crops for food, and building more houses. In March, they met an Indian who could speak English. His name was Samoset. Later, an Indian named Squanto came to live with them, and they met Massasoit, the nearby Indian chief. After they had planted and harvested their first crop, fall came in 1621, and they had a day of Thanksgiving. They were thankful that they had houses to live in. They had food for the coming winter. So they celebrated. Then, 2 years later, in 1623, they had an even bigger harvest. Now, Governor William Bradford said it was time for an even bigger Thanksgiving celebration. For the first time since they had come to America, the Pilgrims had all the food they needed. The corn had grown strong and tall. Their houses had been made ready for winter. They had piles and piles of wood for their fires. They had barrels and barrels of fur ready to ship to England. The corn was picked. So the Pilgrims invited all of their Indian friends to come to Plymouth. The women made lobster pies. They roasted ducks and turkeys. The children went into the woods to find nuts and berries. Tables were set out under the trees. Indians came from far and near. Chief Massasoit arrived with 90 braves. He brought a present of 5 large deer. They roasted the deer over the open fires. Soon, all was ready. The Pilgrims ate and ate with the Indians. They danced and sang for 3 days. It was a happy time. The Pilgrims gave thanks to God that their lives had been spared. They gave thanks for the food and friends they had found in America. And so they began a custom of Thanksgiving that still lives on. The little band of brave Pilgrims would have hard times again, but no time would ever be as hard as the first winter in the wilderness. The courage and strength of this little group has become famous. Today, we call them the Pilgrim Fathers. And this is a statue in Plymouth reminding us of Governor William Bradford, who wrote the history of the Pilgrims so that we can remember it today.